It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me to the esteemed city of Cambridge and this educational institution. I don't ever repeat talks, so what you're getting is completely fresh and new, though it does build on a lot of the work that some of you might have seen before. But especially with folks at university level, I like to bring you along to the front edge or the cutting edge of my thinking, with hopes that you can contribute what you have to offer. So that being said, I think we have a QR code that will be displayed at some point. So some of the stuff that we're going to go through, if you have clarifying questions, it means like you don't understand anything, then just put your hand up and I'll answer them right away, because some of the things are going to require you to follow along. If you have like tangents or ideas or illustrations or other sorts of questions that aren't one of clarifying the understanding, then refer it to the QR code. I personally like to make sure that we don't leave until all questions are answered. So, and as a convert to Islam, there's no such thing as an out-of-bounds question. If it's a stupid one, I'll tell you so, but all questions are welcome. So I was given a somewhat interesting and also important question, which is, oh, by the way, who am I talking to? Raise your hand if you're a STEM major. Oh. All right, raise your hand if you're not a STEM major. Okay, what are some of the that's like 50-50. Okay, what are some folks in the humanities, what are we studying?
I have a bachelor's in law and I make a master.
Okay, very nice. Any others? Yes? Nice, very good. Okay. Anyone in poli-sci? Okay, had a couple. Sociology, that's our little cousin. Yes? Theology. All right, very good. Anybody in education? Astaghfirullah. Who's going to teach the next generation? We have no one in education. Who's going to make the curriculum? All right, anyway, okay, very good. So I was asked to speak about reimagining governance, lessons from Islamic history. I'm going to under-deliver on the lessons from Islamic history because I am not a historian. Though I did start out as a history major, I quickly switched to political science and international relations and political theory when I saw the discipline or the structure of the discipline of history, which is a little bit lacking self-awareness as to its metaphysical underpinnings. Many of you know that I've done a bit of work on Halak. Wa'il Halak, he's a Palestinian thinker. He's a professor at Columbia University in New York City. I'm starting with him, so I'm going to catch you up very quickly on Halak's main contribution to a larger conversation, which has to do with statehood and Islamic governance. What's the relationship between statehood or various political configurations, various political technologies, and Islamic law? So Halak wrote a book that was very controversial that was called The Impossible State. The Impossible State's main thesis was that the nation state is inherently contradictory to Islamic governance. And the reason why that is so is because the nation state amalgamates power in new and, particularly thick ways and intense ways that no other political configuration had done so prior to. And that was inimical, according to Halak, to the structure that is called for in the Sharia, where the ultimate sovereignty is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sharia itself. In the nation-state model, the ultimate sovereignty is with the state. There is no law higher than the state's law. So that was his main thesis. And that's why he named his book The Impossible State. It was kind of like a trigger. It was like a thumbnail that was like clickbait. A lot of people, found it maybe even a misnomer. He was not saying that it's not possible to have Islamic governance. Rather, he was trying to arrive at a place where we could talk about what Islamic governance would look like. It was simply his contention that it's not going to happen through the nation state, that the nation state is set up inherently in a way that will squeak out, squash, suffocate any truly Islamic system. And he went on to clarify some of the doubts or some of the responses in his next book, which was called Restating Orientalism, which is a fantastic book, one of my favorite books. If you like Foucault and you like to hurt yourself, then I recommend that you try to read it. But halak has a side comment, which has not really been talked about, that I think requires further elaboration and theorization on. And that is something that halak says about democracy, and it's very relevant to the topic here tonight. Halak makes a claim, almost in passing, through the elaboration of his thesis, that an actual Islamic governance is more democratic than the actual democracies that we have today. That's a somewhat controversial claim, because if you go onto the street or in your average masjid, especially some of the masjids in London, it's a little rough down there, they're going to say democracy is shirk, right? Democracy is kufr. How could you possibly think that democracy is anything good, you kafir murtad, right? Halak saying the exact opposite. He says, no, it's not necessarily that. What it rather is that what democracy is, if you squint, or if we redefine it, or if we elaborate what is the maqsad, what is the intent of democracy, is better served by Islamic governance than by the constitutional republican or representative democracies that we have today. That opens up a can of worms that I haven't really seen many people explore. And so this is going to be a bit of a journey to attempt to engage in that thread and to unpack it a little bit. What are the implications of it? And what does it draw to mind from the bare bones or the skeleton of Islamic history, especially the formative periods, because we care a little bit more about the formative period as normative practicing Muslims, which the vast majority of us in this room are. In order to have that conversation, we have to interrogate what is democracy in the first place. Is democracy just about voting? Is democracy just about majoritarian rule? Is democracy about representation? Is democracy about sovereignty? If we go to the linguistic meaning of the word, it's a little bit cryptic. It's supposed to be the rule by the people. But how is rule by the people achieved? That is what halak is implicitly arguing for. What halak is implicitly saying, and sometimes explicitly, is that rule by the people, in some understanding of that phrase, is better served by Islamic governance than it is by the constitutional representative democracies that we have today. That seems a little controversial and perhaps surprising. But I think that we've reached a place in 2024 where we can at least say that the forms, right, and the technologies that modern democracies have been practicing and have institutionalized in order to serve the purpose of rule by the people have largely failed. I think that that's a pretty fair assessment that many of us could probably agree to. And what I mean by that is that if you look at certain groups and how they have, let's say, captured institutions and captured law, and they have infiltrated and essentially used the systems of law and politics and the media apparatus or otherwise in societies like the UK and the US, then we have to question, do these societies actually achieve the ultimate goal of democracy, which is rule by the people? Are the people actually ruling? We have voting, we have majority rule, we have representatives, we have a constitution, we have supposedly the sovereignty of the nation, amorphously defined, but do we actually have rule by the people? Have special interest groups, elite interests, been able to use the technologies and the institutions that have been set up in its current configuration in order to undermine and subvert the will of the people or what the people want? I don't know about you all in the UK, but certainly in the US context, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. Voter turnout is so low that it usually hovers around a quarter, especially in the off-year elections or the non-general elections. People are disengaged from civic engagement or from voting or from civil society. I know this is part of a week where we were hoping to talk about the intersection of being engaged and making institutions. And that is something that is undermined sometimes in democracies such as the United States, where the average person on the street gets the feeling that the elite crooks are just kind of running everything and playing the system. This was brought into stark relief by Luigi Mangione, my fellow Italian brother, who gunned down one of the insurance company CEOs in broad day, actually, early morning hours in New York City, which as much as the mainstream media tried to turn the targets against him, they were surprised and even had to acknowledge that the majority of America sympathized with him. So this is something of a flashpoint. We see that many of the systems, governance, social services, otherwise, they're not working the way that perhaps they were intended, or at least hoped that they would work. And so this is pertinent to our conversation and to our inquiry, that do we really have democracy in a meaningful sense? Even though if we have the forms, do we have the substance? Have we achieved its aims? Even if we have some of the technologies and practices of what we would think are democracies, is it actually working the way it is intended? My contention is that it is not. So if we have that, and we can at least agree to the possibility of that, let's flip that equation on the inverse and say, is it possible to have the substance of democracy, which I'm putting forth is rule by the people, without the forms that are usually used to diagnose and recognize a democracy, without formal representation, without formal voting or majoritarian rule, or without full sovereignty given to the amorphously defined nation? Is it possible, if we can have a situation in which we have the form but not the substance, is it possible to have the substance without the form? That is an inquiry that I think needs to be explored, and it's one that is pertinent to the discussion of halak and the idea of Islamic governance being better serving the substance of democracy and what it's all about. Now, again, if we go back to some of the mosques in London, they'd be pulling their hair out at this point, because we're talking about democracy in a non-ideological way. We're opening ourselves to all sorts of possibilities here that are somewhat uncomfortable, maybe different from the way that we're used to thinking about them. I want to run through some of those markers, what are usually used as diagnosing whether a society is a democracy or not, and demonstrate the overlap, because sometimes we get trapped into absolutist thinking where we are posed a question, almost like a do you condemn question, where it is like, is democracy Islamic or not? And the answer is either yes or no. Whereas maybe the answer could be 70% or 60% or sort of, or if this condition is satisfied. There are many possibilities and permutations for a bit of nuance. So I want to go through these markers and I want to explain potential parallels. I'm not extremely 100% confident on all of this, and I could stand to be corrected, but potential parallels and analogs that exist either in the Sharia or in the formative period of Islamic history, and how they align and how they depart a little bit. And the whole purpose of doing this is to try to decouple and disaggregate things that are already aggregated within the Western form of what we think of as democracies. Is it possible to scramble these categories? Is it possible to rearrange things and to put the pieces back together in a different way that is both Islam and democracy? That's sort of an interesting thing that I hope we can explore together. Everybody cool? Everybody with me? All right. So the first is voting. I have a blog piece that I've written on this for Yaqeen Institute. I also had an episode with Paul Williams in Blogging Theology, who I keep missing, by the way. I've been to the UK twice and I've not met the man. And like when I'm in London, he's in Cambridge. And then when I come to Cambridge, he's in London. And then we keep crisscrossing each other. But may Allah preserve him. He's a brilliant person and I have a lot of respect for him. So there's a video that goes into further depth on the status of voting in Islamic fiqh, especially based off of one of the book by one of the surprisingly Saudi ulama, Fahd Saleh Ajlan, who has a book, Al-Intikhabat fil Fiqh Al-Islami, which is a very, very good book in which he runs down many of the scenarios. So I'm not going to go full into that conversation, but if you want more information, you can see those resources. We do have parallels in the Sharia and in the formative period of Islam that seem to resemble something like voting. Recall that after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, the way in which the different khulafa, the commanders of the believers, or however you want to translate that, are appointed varies. Abu Bakr was nominated by unanimous committee. Abu Bakr appoints Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu without any input from anybody else. And then Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he is stabbed, he is lying on his deathbed and he appoints a council. And the logic of that council, and that's a council of the senior companions, is that they are going to vote amongst them to decide who is the next Khalifa. So we have here a straight vote, and it is a straight majoritarian vote as well. So if we bump down from voting to majority rule, that also goes to indicate a potential precedence or a potential analog that we have. Now, if we drill down on one of the details of how that vote took place, we get an even more interesting detail and perhaps a more applicable one, which is the tie-breaking vote, which came down to Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He was undecided, and what he chose to do looks a lot like representative democracy in that he went around the streets of Medina and he asked the people, and some of the narrations report that he asked the women and children as well. So it wasn't even just limited to the Greek conception of democracy. He went and asked everybody, the inhabitants of Medina, who they favored, whether they favored Uthman or Ali. And then he comes back and reports that he found the majority of people favoring Uthman, and so that was his tie-breaking vote. We also see the Prophet ﷺ. Do we have children here? MashaAllah. Assalamu alaikum. I strongly support the inclusion of young children in university spaces. One of the most unnatural things is to gather people according to their age group. And so you only have 18 to 23-year-olds in the same place. We have to have, oh, MashaAllah, Assalamu alaikum. Who do we have here? MashaAllah. No, don't be sorry. No, we appreciate your presence, both of you. Yeah, one of the most unnatural things is to gather simply people of the same age and lock them away from society and tell them that they should produce social theory, right? Normally, the most, I think, natural thing is to embed people with multiple generations to benefit from the young, to benefit from the old. So I'm very much an advocate of that. Okay, so we have something that looks like majority rule. We also have examples of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam during his time appealing to the majority, or at least inquiring into what is the will of the majority. If you see how he approached sallallahu alaihi wasallam the Battle of Badr, when he is there with a raiding force or a raiding party that comes in contact with an entire army, and he is basically taking their temperature, seeing what their opinions are, seeing what they want to do, and he deferred to what everyone wanted to do, or at least the vast majority, which was to engage the enemy. If you saw at the Battle of Uhud, he did a similar thing where he himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had a dream that indicated that the better strategy would be to stay inside of the city of Medina and fight and engage the enemy there. And yet, the majority of his companions wanted something different. A mix of the hypocrites who were just trying to, grandstand, and the companions who had missed out on the Battle of Badr, who decided that they wanted to march out and meet the enemy in a more dramatic and traditional sense. So we see the Prophet ﷺ engaging in the majority or having some reference, and we can dispute perhaps the degree of deference to that majority, but we see that there's some sort of precedent and some sort of analog there. And then we have the many ahadith where the Prophet ﷺ talked about the jama'ah, the mass body of Muslims, and how there is guidance and there is safety and there's a certain gravity in the jama'ah. That the jama'ah, the great mass of Muslims, provides sort of a safeguard for maybe a fringe esotericism or other things that might happen politically, theologically, otherwise, that are not really supported by the deen. That's like a populist streak, or something that perhaps is akin to a populist streak in how Islam is set up, that the jama'ah has some sort of authority, and even more so if we go to ijma', which is a consensus. We've talked about representation with the story of Abdurrahman bin Auf. Now, sovereignty, my argument or my preliminary thought is that of all of these elements, that sovereignty is really the one that is most different. That we can find analogs that can, I think, parallel things like voting or the technology of voting or majority rule or representation. By the way, Sheikh Fahd Saleh Ajlan's book goes into the rulings and the different statements of the ulama on using those technologies within a Sharia system. It's quite interesting. But sovereignty is really the rub, and that is going back to Halak's point, that maybe the difference or the biggest difference between what we understand readily as modern constitutional democracies and a Sharia system or a system of Islamic governance is the location of sovereignty. And certainly that is the crux of Halak's argument, that the idea of the nation state locates, which is, is tied to how we think about modern democracies, puts the location of sovereignty in the nation, that is the people themselves. And it is supposedly an unqualified sovereignty. Supposedly they give up some of their rights to the government in order for the protection, security, and the services that the government provides. Whether you believe that story, I don't really, but that's the Lockean sort of legitimizing discourse. The idea still is that the sovereignty belongs to a nation, even if it's just discursively and not actually the material reality. The idea is that the sovereignty belongs to the nation, and the nation is the really only issue or only location of sovereignty. That's a big difference from Islam, which puts Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the ultimate sovereign, and any other sovereignty that exists is derivative and secondary to his sovereignty. So Allah expresses his will, his sovereign will, through the Sharia. Yes, the Sharia is interpreted by a class of scholars called the ulama. Yes, there is derivative authority in things like the jama'ah and things like ijma', and even things like the bay'ah, things like the Pledge of Allegiance, and the recognition of the community of a particular leader. But certainly we would say that the amount of sovereignty that is located within the ummah itself is less intense and more conditional and more derivative than the sovereignty that supposedly exists in the nation. Okay, so let's get to Halak's argument that Islamic governance is more democratic than the democracies that we see today. If you've read Halak, you understand that he goes through part of his construction of this argument is through his claim that the Sharia produces a very localist network and web of scholars of different types that have an interface with the people, and that interface between the interpretation and application of the Sharia and the people is where the rule of the people happens, the back and forth at that interface. So he specifically talks about different figures within the Sharia that indicate this, or different tasks, such as the Qadi. So the Qadi is the judge, and he talks about the difference between modern law and Islamic law, and he talks about the difference between Western court systems and Islamic court systems, and how Islamic court systems are meant to be much more egalitarian. They're meant to be much more equal access. You're not supposed to fear getting sued or fear having to sue somebody. You're supposed to be able to approach the Qadi with a very low barrier of entry. Besides the financial costs of legal fees, also the language through which arguments are made in the system are supposed to be access or freely accessible to everybody. They are the common language of the Sharia, which has an element of public reason to it, as opposed to, God help you if you have to read like a lawyer's document and understand a contract. It is written in legalese intentionally so that it creates a separate class of lawyers that require a separate training, that it's a gatekeeping mechanism so that nobody can take the law into their own hands or really represent themselves, at least very successfully. So that is an important aspect that Halak refers to in trying to demonstrate which of these two systems shows a greater rule by the people, a system in which litigation can happen in a context that is open to all and accessible to all, or at least more so than the system that we currently have today, where it is an extremely specialized area that requires a fair bit of resources, certainly a lot of time, in order to engage in. The second character of the Islamic law that Halak talks about and that we'll mention here is the mufti. Of course, the mufti is the one who is giving non-binding religious opinions on individual or local cases. So what's the ruling about vaping? What's the ruling about or edibles, or every single new thing that's coming down the pipeline? Now, Halak argues that the mufti is one of the most important aspects of the mufti is that he is locally embedded in the neighborhoods and the place where he resides. So he has an understanding of custom. I should take another sip of this coffee. He has an understanding of the local custom, which plays into his iftat and how the body of iftat and these types of legal verdicts are arrived at. He is largely autonomous, which is another extremely important thing that I forgot to mention about the judge as well. autonomous in the sense that he is recognized by the mass of the people. It's almost as if the people recognize the quality of the scholar, which seems counterintuitive because you would say, well, how could the masses really verify whether a scholar was qualified or not? Well, they couldn't necessarily, but the twin way of having an ijazah system where people are individually getting credentials from other senior scholars and licenses to teach, with also something of a populist system of recognition that the people are following Abu Hanifa and the people are following Imam Malik and they're following a Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed, that they are recognizable as the masters in their field. That is something that also is a vector of rule by the people. Now imagine if, let's try to think of a modern application of that. Imagine if MPs, okay, I'll give an American example because we like to make fun of Americans, right? We can beat down on the Americans. Some of the people in the Congress are idiots. They are some of the most ignorant people that you've ever met. And I'm sure with social media, you've seen some examples of that. So imagine if there was something of a system that the vote isn't doing it, apparently, but imagine if there was a system of recognition where people were recognized as top of their field or elites in their field based off of public or popular recognition of a certain type of prowess or effectiveness. We could argue that there could be workarounds for that, or that could go awry very quickly. That's possible. But again, we're just trying to compare two ways of doing things. That there is a vector through the mufti and the recognition of the skill of the mufti that is popular, that doesn't really have, I don't think, an analog in modern democracies. And it gets you to think, again, by what mechanisms are we achieving a democratic society which supposedly is ruled by the people. Now, that's just one way in which they are autonomous. The other way is the structure of education. This is one of Halak's hobby horses, where he talks about how one of the nation states' major interventions, and this goes along the Foucauldian difference between sovereign and disciplinary power, is the Ministry of Education, right? The centralization of education and curriculums and the stranglehold of controlling what people learn, and that whole process of being or transformation and subject formation that comes about from that, right? Halak's argument is that before the modern era, and certainly in the early formative period of the Sharia, that the religious education was something that was also localized and autonomous, that they were structured and funded by religious endowments or charitable endowments that did not have a whole bunch of say, practically speaking, in what was being taught. And so that there was an atmosphere and a structure of very, very autonomous learning that was going on that allowed a certain meritocracy to take place, where the best and brightest were allowed to rise to the top, at least in theory. The third type of person within this system is the faqih. And the faqih is the person who interprets the law. They're the people that write the books. They're the people that teach the fiqh in the halaqat or later in the universities. We have many of the similar characteristics as the previous two, such as supposedly the autonomous education, the knowledge production that is supposedly outside of the grasp of the centralized state, or at least the state is not yet centralized enough in order to have full mastery and control over the production of knowledge, and that these things are funded by the waqf. So in summary, one of Halak's main arguments is that the role of the sultan or the central government is much weaker than compared to modern democracies, where the governments, they have their fingers very, very deep in everything. The level of penetration and control is much more. Why this is relevant to this topic is because, again, we are trying to assess by what means is rule of the people actually achieved. If you have a centralized government, such as the nation state, even if it has the trappings of democracy, it has voting, it has majority rule, it has representation, it has sovereignty, it has a constitution. However, it also has a nation state that has a modus operandi of itself. It has extreme penetration and control of media, of thought, of knowledge production, education, all of these things. What avenues and vectors are there for the people to actually rule? Have we reached a situation where the forms of rule by the people have been, we can tick them off, but the substance has been lost or subverted in any other way? And the inverse or the converse or the implication of that, is it possible that an Islamic system of governance, excuse me, is it possible that an Islamic system of governance actually provides a better method of rule by the people than the so-called democracies today, where there is an interface locally, there is this sort of back and forth recognition of expertise, and everything else that we've mentioned. Now, getting to the last major topic, okay, what else is there within? So I just basically summarized halak for you. It saved you a bunch of time and a lot of acrimony. What else is there in the Sharia from other parts of my training that might bolster this argument or complicate it or further it or generate some interesting discussion? There's an interesting feature, I think, in Islamic governance, which is the organic innovation of systems, institutions, and disciplines. And I think if we look at this from a very, very high level, we'll see that my argument, I'll throw my thesis out there in front, is that there is more structural potential for change and dynamism in Islamic governance than there seems to be in democracies, or what we recognize as modern democracies. That Islamic governance and even the Islamic society, which included not just the governance, but the production of knowledge, the training of scholars, the training of students, seems to have mechanisms that accommodate flexibility and change and accountability in really interesting and unique ways that haven't, to my knowledge, and people here might know better than me, that haven't necessarily been optimized or explored. One of the fundamental aspects of the Sharia that is crucial to the entire conversation is that the Sharia is rational. That we know that the Sharia is rational. And this is the aqidah of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that af'alullah mu'allalah, that there is ta'lil, there is illah behind the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does, whether we know it or not. Now that's a separate question of whether we have epistemological access to those ilal, to those reasons or rationale, but we have it on faith, or let's say axiomatically, that there is rationality in the Sharia. That's what makes qiyas possible. That's what makes analogical reasoning possible. There's also this thing of default permissibility, that if we're out of the realm of ritual acts of worship, your 5 pillars, your salah, and your siyam, and your zakat, and your hajj, then the default, according to the vast majority of scholars, is that something is permissible unless there is explicit evidence to prove that is impermissible. That sets up a really interesting ecosystem in which there's actually a tremendous potential for innovation and change. Sorry, Salafis, innovation, and the good type of innovation. We're not talking about blameworthy innovations here. So we also have analogs and examples of the companions especially exercising this type of reasoning and instituting changes themselves in the early period of the Khulafa al-Rashidin, of the early righteously guided caliphs. There are situations where rulings are changed based off of changing circumstances that a more literalist interpretation would have a lot of issues with, because it seems like somebody is ruling against what the Prophet ﷺ ruled against, or what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ruled. But the reality is that the companions understood the rational basis of the Sharia, and they were simply fulfilling the substance of the rulings through other means, rather than ossifying and clinging to the form of the rulings and potentially negating its substance. The famous example is the example of lost camels. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, if there were camels that were runaway camels, he was asked about it, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he said to leave them. And he said very explicitly to leave them be. Either the wolf is going to get it or the owner is going to find it, one of the two. When you get to the time of Uthman changed the government's attitude towards lost and found and towards lost camels. They actually had an active policy of gathering those camels and bringing them in, because the circumstances had changed. Medina was a thriving metropolis, banditry and theft was common, and rather than waste the wealth of the Muslims, there was at least an effort to collect it. Someone with a more superficial understanding of the Sharia would come and say, Uthman, what are you doing? You're changing a ruling that the Prophet ﷺ gave explicitly. But the companions understood the underlying rationality of the rulings in the Sharia, and they adapted them in order to fulfill the maqasid. I hate to use that term because it's overused and misinterpreted, but we could say, let's stick to English, the substance of those rulings and the intended objectives of those rulings, rather than merely the shell or the form. This was similar to Umar ibn al-Khattab when he was the Khalifa, he prohibited the companions from resettling in the far-flung areas of the Muslim empire or Islamic empire, whatever you want to call it. Of course, that changed with Uthman, who permitted it, and then you see a different scenario. Maybe more applicable is Umar, his use of the diwan, which it's a very famous example, but a lesser known thing is that the diwan was also a way, or also served to pay diya, pay blood money. Okay, what's the diwan and how does this work? So if someone kills someone by accident, it's a manslaughter case. Normally, in the explicit rulings of the Sharia, that is borne by the aqila. The aqila is like your relative. So your group of relatives is responsible for paying blood money for that offense. But in Umar's time, when the Islamic empire had expanded, what you had was armies and garrison cities and people living far from their families. So if someone was guilty of manslaughter, it became very, very cumbersome and difficult to use that same technique or that same unit of social organization to fulfill that role. So Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu used the diwan in order to satisfy it. So basically you had a register of people with similar occupations or similar occupations, and they would form a type of guild, I guess you could call it, or a unit. And that was something that took the place of the aqila in cases of diya where blood money had to be paid. Again, someone with a more superficial understanding of the Sharia would say, Umar, what are you doing? This is completely changing the ruling that the Prophet ﷺ gave us directly. But Umar ibn Khattab and the other companions, especially the rightly guided caliphs, they understood the underlying rationality of the Sharia, and that you want to satisfy the objectives of the Sharia and the substance of what the rulings are intended to achieve, rather than merely grasping onto the form. That's one. Two is maslahah, is the idea of common good or public good. And this is something, unfortunately, that has been abused in our times, similar to maqasid, but this is something that is very important. And you don't even need to go to maslahah mursala, which is a type of evidence that is disagreed upon by the classical ulama. There is something that is less controversial than that called maslahah mu'tabara. That there are masalih, there are interests, there are objectives that are in the Sharia explicitly, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala names and that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam names. So for example, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, it's prohibited for two people to speak to the exclusion of a third. That means if us three guys are hanging out and I take one aside and I whisper, 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 that's not allowed because I'm making the third person feel uncomfortable. And the Prophet ﷺ actually explicitly said, because that bothers the third one, or that makes him sad, or that affects his emotional state. So because we have that rational undergirding for that ruling, we know that that is a maslahah mu'tabara. That is something that the Sharia is concerned about, or Allah is concerned about through His Sharia. That anything else that bothers or saddens or troubles your brother or your sister in Islam takes a similar ruling. And so then we can extend it to other things that might achieve the same goal. Okay? Now, this becomes important when we look at both, things that we are doing and things that we are not doing. One of the things, let's take the proliferation of endowments, so the waqf or the awqaf system. This is something that was a maslaha mu'tabara. This was something, a recognized interest or public interest of the Muslims in order to have this waqf system. Now, the waqf system was in place from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he encouraged to it, but it really exploded after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, to the point where almost everything that you can think that a modern government provides, a charitable endowment used to provide it at some point in Islamic history, whether it comes to hospitals or insane asylums or public drinking water or fountains or gardens, or the list goes on. And there's a famous story in Damascus of someone bringing a dish of some food and dropping it, and it breaks, and then someone tells them, hey, go to the waqf that replaces people's broken dishes, right? So they were really, really into this idea of proliferation of the endowment, that is a maslaha mu'tabara, that is something that is in the public interest of the Muslims, and therefore the extension of those things, and that's where it's relevant to the whole concept of Islamic governance and rule by the people, that is something that can be developed, or an avenue or vector that can be developed. The Ottoman millet system is another example. This is something that was based off of the dhimmi system, which is very normative in Islamic law, but it was an extension of that and a further institutionalization of that. Even when it comes to the production of knowledge in general and the generation of new disciplines within Islam, that is something that is not in the Quran or in the Sunnah. Nobody told anybody to invent usul al-fiqh. Nobody told anybody to invent, the science of ilal or mustalah al-hadith. That the formation of these branches of knowledge, these disciplines of knowledge, they were something that was understood to be in the masalih of the Muslims, that this was a maslaha mu'tabara, that this was something that was in the service of the Muslims, and so that it was extended and extended and extended in new and interesting ways that served the goals of the Sharia. If you want to look at a very modern example, we could perhaps say prayer apps, right? You don't have to look at the sun anymore and measure your shadow and, oh, geez, it's like, where is it? We're all lazy now. We all look at the clock and it's 8:42, and that's when, Islamic Finder says it's Fajr. Unless you're really nerding out on the 18 degrees versus the 16 degrees versus the 14 degrees, which is probably actually an interesting discussion in the UK, not as much in the US. But most people just open the app, right? And so that is something where it has benefited the Muslims, or at least it's an attempt. You can have taqweem, you can have an evaluation to see, well, did this really benefit the Muslims or not? But the idea is that these are the avenues and vectors through which you can actually achieve rule by the people, or people participating in Islamic governance in order to make life better. On the flip side, you also have the prevention of certain things, such as sadd al-dhari'a. This is known in fiqh as sadd al-dhari'a, or blocking the means. So if we look at one example, Umar ibn Khattab was very forward thinking, and when he conquered Palestine, he made it a waqf. And that was brilliant, because you can't give away a waqf. And so we see the ramifications of that and its responsibility, or its bearing upon us and our responsibilities today. You could also say that blocking the means comes up in zakat eligibility. We have a problem in the US, I don't know if you share the same problem, of everything under the sun being zakat eligible. My cat is zakat eligible, and my holidays are zakat eligible. And this is an abuse. And so we see that if zakat, by the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, is designed to be taken from the rich and given to the poor, and this main objective of the Sharia is not being met, even if the technical aspect of zakat, yes, technically we can make a way out, fi sabilillah, everything that is ta'lif al-qulub, things that are recognized as categories, we can hack them, right? This is the anti-hacking mechanism. We can hack them into making them work for us and what we want to do, but we have things such as sadd al-dhari'a, blocking the means, that will prevent that hacking from taking place, at least hopefully. One last thing, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is again just my preliminary thoughts, and I hope that you can contribute to this and problematize it and contradict everything I said, which is implied obligations and derivative obligations. This is encapsulated in the principle مَا لَا يُتِمُّ وَاجِبٌ إِلَّا بِهِ فَوَاجِبٌ, that if something is required in the deen, then anything else that is essential to that requirement being fulfilled also becomes required. The very simple, basic example that's always given is prayer and wudu. You have to have wudu in order to fulfill your obligation to pray. Therefore, even if we had no ayah in the Quran telling us to make wudu, wudu would be required, because we need it to fulfill this other thing. Well, let's scale that up and think about all the other things that Allah requires us to do. Allah requires us to establish justice. Allah requires us to have a certain amount of wealth redistribution through zakat and other means. So what are all of the furud kifaya, the communal obligations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires us to do, and what are all the things that are underneath of them that could facilitate or might be even essential to the fulfillment of those obligations? That is a huge area that needs to be explored. And this is where we get into examples similar to like the Diwan and how it functioned at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, that we have to pay the diya, you have to pay the blood money. What do you do to pay the blood money if the aqilah is no longer even functional? We have to find another way. So I think we'll wrap it up here, and we'll open it up to questions. And I know that there's some, mashallah, accomplished people in the room, and I'd really like your feedback here and your thoughts. That achieving good governance, which is, I think, the ultimate goal, achieving good governance, it requires a certain amount of innovation, a certain amount of flexibility, and a certain recourse to change. And my hot take is that the Sharia and Islamic governance, and even historical early in the formative period examples of Islamic governance, seem to have a lot more built-in flexibility, built-in dynamism, built-in localism when it comes to everything that we've discussed, culture production, knowledge production. That seems to me to satisfy the idea of rule by the people in a better, more robust way, in a more substantive way than what our modern democracies have come to. Now, there is a caveat here that we don't necessarily believe in the literal rule by the people, but we do believe in rule by Allah and rule by the believers. So maybe we can call it a mu'minocracy or something like that. I don't know, we can coin a different term. The point is that we can't lose the forest through the trees, rather than get hung up on, and this is actually a qaida fiqhiyya, that we don't get hung up, on what things are called. We try to ascertain what things are actually the reality of them, right? And so if I had this cup and I gave it to you and I said, hey, drink this, that this is khamr, this is alcohol, that's still permissible for you because there's coffee in here, there's not alcohol. It doesn't matter what I call it. So we can call something a democracy and it might not actually satisfy rule by the people, and vice versa. We can call something, or something could be Islamic governance or good governance, and it might also satisfy rule by the people, or at least by degree, if not entirely. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala